Today I continue my mini-series on the book of Exodus, or the beginning of the book of Exodus. As Pastor Ann said this summer, that seems to bring so much violence and controversy and heat warnings. I'm drawn to this book that tells how God's people were redeemed from the oppression of slavery. I've skipped the text between our first reading and our second. We heard of the harrowing story of Moses' birth, and the middle stories are, of course, important. But I'm interested in this text towards chapter 3, so I want you to listen to the whispers in the text. I'm interested in the hope and the actions of the community of women, and how these women became a community of liberation for the entire people. Exodus 3, verses 16 to 22. And this is God speaking. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham and Isaac, of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I've given heed to you and what has been done in Egypt. I declare to you that I will bring you out of the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. They will listen to your voice, and you, the elders of Israel, should go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us now go 3 days' journey into the wilderness so we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. I know, however, that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all of the wonders that I will perform before it. After that, he will let you go. I will bring this people into such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. Each woman shall ask her neighbor and any woman living in the neighbor's house for jewelry of silver and of gold and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, and you shall plunder the Egyptians. The word of the Lord. Last weekend, along with two fabulous chaperones, I had the opportunity to accompany some of our high schoolers and their friends on an urban plunge in DC. We stayed at the Pilgrimage, a learning service hostel run out of the Church of the Pilgrims near DuPont Circle. Going in, I thought that the purpose of the weekend was to teach our teenagers more about the root causes of poverty and homelessness, all while reflecting on our faith and engaging in a bit of group bonding. And don't get me wrong, the weekend did include those things, overplayed by a reflection of our faith. We learned about the stats comparing the different quadrants in DC. We learned about diversity and disparity between schools and neighborhoods. We walked a lot, got some blisters, and we observed a lot of Pokemon being played around the national monuments. And we ate some really good ice cream. But there was more. There's always more, isn't there? We began the weekend hearing from two individuals from the Homeless Speakers Bureau experiencing or formerly experiencing homelessness. I'm using their real names because they said we could. Eric, our first speaker, started telling us about his story experiencing homelessness, about the struggle of being 30-some children in a family with parents who cared but just couldn't take care of all of them. But I have to tell you, and I have to admit to the youth too who are here, I wasn't really able to concentrate on his story fully because 2 days before I had this root canal. So more I was thinking about during his presentation was keeping the painkillers down and remembering to put oral gel every so often. But thank goodness for second opportunities, and that would come in a bit. Linda's story came next. How as a preteen, trauma had come to her, a trauma that she couldn't get over, a trauma that she tried to medicate and dissolve with risky behavior. Sometime later, she had a child, and she managed to ignore her pain for a while without the help of other distractions. But that only lasted for so long, and then things got worse. But then she told us she found this community that she could relate to, that she could listen to, that she could become real with, that she could give over her pain, and that they would welcome her in. And then slowly things started to get better. By the time she came to talk to us, she had already been in that darkest place and she'd seen the light. Now she helps her son, taking care of her grandchild, Treasure, age 2, who is everything that the name implies. So after we heard them, we walked towards the DuPont fountain, the youth and the chaperones moving faster in front with Eric. Linda, Treasure, and I moved at toddler pace behind, and you know what that pace is. I missed my little one, so I got to pick her up, and I carried her on my hip. We looked different, but people in the neighborhood, I think they thought she was my child because she was so outgoing and so friendly and so open. They smiled at me. I think they thought I was her mom. I really liked that. So while Treasure and I played once we got to the fountain, Eric and Linda led the high schoolers in handing out what I hope to be fabulous lunches to people around the fountain experiencing homelessness. And they were good lunches that we would want ourselves, but the Gatorade was way too small for the heat. For a moment, our students and chaperones, Eric and Linda, and those that they met shared a smile, a conversation. They might have exchanged names. Most of the conversations, I understand, were about the 95-degree all-out heat and humidity, much like today, hotter than the sanctuary. When the heat advisory says that you shouldn't risk prolonged exposure to being outside. But what happens when you have nowhere else to go? It didn't hit me until we were headed back to the pilgrimage, the youth talking about their experiences, me still kind of massaging my tooth, Treasure now riding high on Eric's shoulders while Linda walked protectively behind. That Eric, Linda, and Treasure had opened up their hearts and welcomed us into their community. They didn't know anything about us other than we were from New York Avenue. But they offered the stories of their entire lives, and they offered it with such realness, offering us a true relationship in which, through the sharing of stories, we were offered an opportunity to be changed, to go beyond ourselves, perhaps even to see a new glimpse of God, a fresh glimpse of God, listening to God through the whispers of the city. This is the God who, as the Apostle Paul says, uses the poor to shame the strong. This is the God who stands up radically on the side of the poor. This is the God where everyone has a place and everyone is valued in the community. This is the God who invites each of us into a whole new cross-cultural, cross-political, cross-experiential community to be agents in God's redemptive plan of deliverance of the world. Big agents. In fact, it is our calling to be ambassadors of Christ, right? So we turn back to our first reading. Remember that story. And I wanted to title the sermon, The Princess, the Preteen, and the Mom, and put that out front, but I wasn't brave enough. It seemed maybe kind of irreverent. But there is the mom, Jochebed. We get her name later in the text, and I think we're given it later because they want us to remember who she is. Unspeakable violence has come to her family. Like Mary in the Jesus narrative, though, she does everything in her power to save that child. She makes a papyrus basket, as I told the children, but if we look at the Hebrew, it's not just a basket. It's the same word used for ark as used for the Ark of Noah. So she literally builds this child an ark. It is a boat. And then she lines it with the same tools of oppression used against her. We remember that the Hebrews had to use the bitumen and pitch to build up the pyramids, or we presume it was the pyramids. So she lines this ark with that same pitch. It becomes waterproof. And then we say that she sets him on the side of the Nile by the reeds. I don't think she ever thought he was actually going to float away. This was her child. This was a 3-month-old baby. And then I like to think that Miriam was a preteen, and her job was to keep watch. And we'll celebrate Miriam in her own right in a couple of weeks. But I think this keeping watch, this role that Miriam has to do, protects and saves not only her brother, but all of the Hebrew people. And as a preteen, this is her first foray into justice work. The princess comes to bathe. And I think we all know that, they knew when she was coming. She probably came at the same time every week or every day. The princess is an overdog, not the underdog. She is the one with the comparable privilege. So she could have ignored the baby and followed her father's decree. It would have been the easier thing to do. It would have been her safest position. She could have seen the baby and be moved by its cries, picked him up and handed him to one of her attendants and said, just, quietly take care of this baby. Don't let my dad know. But I'll save it, but we won't make any show. But she takes the most powerful, most cross-cultural move, and as if to advertise her intentions. She calls out to the whole community, both Hebrew and Egyptian, and she says, "This must be one of the Hebrew children. Let's go find a nurse for him." So the preteen, Miriam, finds the mom, Jochebed. Mom and baby are reunited, at least until he's weaned. The king pays Jochebed for her troubles. This is all unbeknownst to him, of course. The liberation of the Hebrew people is all put in place by a group of women who come together in spite of all of that culture and all of that pressure that sought to keep them apart. But then it gets even better. The group of women doesn't fall apart. It isn't as if they came together over one miraculous act and then just fall off from each other. The reason why I've included our second reading is because it tells that this first encounter, from this first experience working together in this emergency situation, that a new relationship emerges. From Exodus 3:22. Each woman shall ask a neighbor and any woman living in the neighbor's house for jewelry of silver and of gold and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, and you shall plunder the Egyptians. It's the Egyptian women who helped the Hebrews escape slavery and enter into a new life of liberation. These women cross boundaries put up by background and class. By crossing these boundaries, they establish new relationships, and in establishing new relationships together, they topple that bad and evil king together. They topple the giant. They live into the belief that every person, every creature, every child was created by God and loved by God. And because every child, every person, every creature comes from God, in order to accomplish God's work, we must enter into relationships with those who we consider to be radically different from ourselves. We must take a wide view of creation, a panoramic lens. In their actions of saving the innocents, in their actions working ethically together, they become agents of God's deliverance. And then we find the hope. It's a hope that's born out of this cross-cultural relationship that literally becomes the saving difference between life and death, slavery and freedom, fear, despair, and turning to hope. In a time when we as a nation seem to be growing further apart, we as a world seem to be growing further apart, when we seem to live around like-minded people, maybe even the people on our social networks are like-minded, when we fear casting our political views off into the world because we fear being attacked, we fear getting into conversation, when we put up different polls and cast each other in those polls. Such an important time to get to know people from different perspectives. I tried this on Facebook some months ago, you might know. I tried to say, hey, could a Trump supporter maybe have coffee with me? I'd love to get together. But nobody replied. I have some friends on Facebook. I couldn't find a single one, but I think I put it the wrong way. I think people thought I wanted to get into an argument with you. I wanted to argue why that isn't my belief or not who I'm supporting, and that isn't the point. My point was I wanted to have conversation over lunch or coffee or whatever this person and I enjoy so we could find things that we share. I wanted to talk about how our kids don't want to walk, they always want to be carried, how work is hard, how heat is difficult. I just wanted to talk about the experiences of being human. So I'm going to try again. Because it's essential that we engage across these cross-boundary relationships, these relationships that start small, maybe just talking about our common love of Cheerios. Or perhaps they begin with conversations like the ones that the youth and I share between Eric, Linda, and Treasure. So then the next time that we see them around town, there might be a point of connection. We might say hi. And then the next time I see them in a community meeting, which I'm sure at least we'll see Eric because he's a community leader, together we can dream dreams and we can think about not just bringing sandwiches, but what to do with people who are around the fountain in that 95-degree heat who have nowhere else to go. And perhaps Linda can give me some lessons on parenting. The relationship can work both ways. Or I think of the relationships forged between our international partners. I think of my friend Carmina, who's a translator for our groups, who go to Cuba. Or the budding relationship with Fernando, who is a person from their community in Cuba who's going to go to seminary. Wouldn't it be fun to have him as an intern here? Just like Angela, who was our young adult volunteer this past year. I think of relationships from our Kenya partners like George and Catherine when they got us all to dance up here in front, when Roger and I literally just waved hands in the air as good American Presbyterians. These are the kind of partnerships we see forming in the Radcliffe Room and on Tuesdays in the Job Seekers Club. These men and women who come not only to find jobs, but to find relationships, find a place to be heard and connect. And we who have jobs, it's not just about help, but it's about finding a deep connection between people. These relationships start small, and hopefully they eventually become a partnership when we are opened up to the realness of one another. And in that space of realness, we're able to dream and hope, and in that hope, we're able to do God's action. It starts with an openness, and with the openness, there is a risk. Through the risk of openness, we can be led to a new kind of hope, and it is a hope that ushers in action and ushers in God's deliverance for all. Amen.